John chapter 9, and we are going to start in verses 4 and 5 and take our title from there and then look at the rest of this passage here this morning. John chapter 9 and verse number 4 says, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Look at this passage this morning. Title is The Works of God. In verse number 1, we read this, and as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? We see that Jesus passed by, and that's a wonderful title, and you can run that through the Gospels. But notice back up in chapter 8 where we were last week in verse 59, it says, Then they took up stones to cast at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. And that thought continues into chapter 9, and as Jesus passed by. So I want you to bring into context the interaction he has with this blind man. He is leaving a scene where the Jews have picked up stones to stone him, and he is trying to remove himself from that situation. Chapter 9 is a great example of the care that Jesus Christ has for those that he loves. Jesus Christ cares for you whether you realize it or not. And it doesn't matter what's going on in his life. He still cares for you, and he wants to work in your life just as much from day to day. That never goes away. That never changes. We're the only one that changes. Right? From day to day, we're different people. From moment to mood swing, we're different people. Right? We're all over the place. We got home last night, and my wife said, my social battery is on empty. And I said, check. I don't think Ben's social battery is ever on empty. Is that right? Yeah, his wife is shaking her head. Yeah, Ben is the hippest Bible believer that I know. I've always said that about Ben. His hair is going to be perfect. He's going to be wearing the clothes that you're supposed to be wearing. And I aspire to be Ben someday. It's really a goal of my life to do that. But we're the ones that are back and forth and up and down. Jesus Christ is leaving a scene where they want to stone him and they want to kill him. And as he passes by, he notices this blind man sitting there. Isaiah prophesied of this in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1. He said, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. Jesus said in Luke 19:10, The Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost. Jesus sees him in verse 1 in his condition. Now this blind man is not crying out as was Bartimaeus, but he's still in the same condition that Bartimaeus was in. Maybe he stops, right? Maybe he pauses. Maybe he heals him, but I don't know that he does without the disciples being the examples of us. You notice what the disciples just did here? When they saw the situation, I know we live in a world where we don't judge anybody anymore, and it's a wonderful place to live. The freedom you feel from the lack of judgment is really liberating. The disciples prove that we are no different from 29 AD to 2024. We are the same people. And on first glance, you already know what you think about that person. And so as they pass by, the disciples stop, and they began a conversation with Jesus Christ. So let's take this morning and look at chapter 9, and let's look at the works of God as Jesus described them as. His disciples ask in verse number 2, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. You want to learn a lesson? What's going on in your life may be this. that God just wants to show himself through you. Number one, let's look at this. We see the works of God through the eyes of reasoning. The disciples begin to reason among themselves. It's a popular word in the Gospels, whether it's the Pharisees or the disciples themselves. Everybody's reasoning. In other words, we're sitting around throwing around our opinion of what we think happened. And before we throw stones, like the Jews in verse 59, at the disciples, we do the same stuff. Oh, they got cancer? Got to be sin. Or it just could be cancer. Oh, God didn't heal him? Wicked lifestyle. Or it could just be that God didn't heal him. But we're no different, right? I know not you. You've never done this yourself. Notice verse 6. He said, when he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way, therefore, and washed, and came seeing. The neighbors, therefore, and they which before had seen him that he was blind, said, is not this he that sat and begged? Some said, yeah, this is he. Others said, he is like him. But he said, I am he. Therefore said they unto him, how were thine eyes opened? He answered and said, a man that is called Jesus made clay, and anointed mine eyes, and said unto me, go to the pool of Siloam, and wash. And I went and washed, and received sight. And then said they unto him, where is he? He said, I know not. The eyes of reasoning, when we're reasoning, we have questions, don't we? And when we're going through things in life, there's always questions. And here's what I've learned in my life. 85.7% of my questions, God's never going to answer. He's just going to let them go. You're here this morning because God didn't answer 95% of my questions. 99. So we have some questions. The disciples asked the first one in verse 2. Who did sin? That's human nature. If something bad is going on in someone's life, then they can't be a good person. That it has to, well, they probably deserved it. And Jesus' response was, hey, wait a minute. Nobody sinned. You know why this man is blind? So that God can get some glory. You know why your heart might be broken today? So that God can get some glory. You know why your life feels confusing and you're living in a fog and you don't understand and this doesn't make sense and I'm doing my best to add all this together and I get a negative every time I do? So God can get some glory out of it. So the works of God can be made manifest, but if we're not careful, we look at the works of God through the eyes of reasoning and we'll reason ourselves right out of God working in our life. And what God wanted to accomplish will never be accomplished in our life. Notice the second question in verse 8. They said, is not this he that sat and begged? Isn't this the guy that our whole life that none of us have cared for and that we've ignored and none of us have ever given anything to, but we know who he is and he's super annoying and he's always isn't this the guy? Paul said in Romans 11:33, oh, the depth and riches both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. His ways aren't our ways. Isn't this the guy? Like, in other words, what's he doing here? Who let him in? How was he allowed to enter? You know what we always forget? We always forget that God does what he wants when he wants. And never one time in my life have I ever had God ask permission. The man was blind, and Jesus had the ability, so he healed him. And moved on. Here's the third question. Verse 10. How are thine eyes open? You're going to have to explain this to us. Have you ever tried to explain how God works in your life? I'll take notes. If you want to give it a go, I'll take all the notes that you want me to take. And when you've talked in the same circle for the past 30 minutes, Ben and I had conversations about hey, I'm pretty sure that God was going to do this in my life, and Dad was going to retire, and I was going to be the pastor, and I don't even know. And I said, yeah, I've been there. Why? Because you can't explain why God does what he does and why God does it in the timing that he does it. So for him to explain, hey, how were thine eyes open? But notice the simplicity that he uses in verse 11. And if you're ever going to answer someone else of how God's worked in your life, this is the best example of how to do it. He said, a man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said unto me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight. Yeah, but what are the real details of it? It's like when you say, well, why are you doing that? Well, because God gave me direction, and this is what I'm doing, and he's blessing, and this is the direction we're going. Yeah, but who did you talk to about it? What other pastor that's been in the ministry for 55 years did you get the blessing from? Right? Those are the games that we play. They said, hey, how did you receive your sight? And he literally said, well, this dude, somebody called Jesus, so he didn't even know who he was. He made some clay, and then he put it on my eyes. And then he said, go wash it off, and I was like, thanks. Good idea. So I did, and now I can see. Well, that's not theologically sound enough. That's not the tea that they wanted spilt. They wanted the gory details. And he's just like, literally he said, I don't know. I literally don't know how this happened. Notice the fourth question in verse 12. They said this, well, where is he? Were they looking for the loaves and the fishes, I wonder? Or is this just the common question, Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, the wise men to Herod, where is he that is born King of the Jews? Can I ask you this? Where is Jesus working in your life right now? Could you be explaining to someone, not the details, but just saying this? And I think this is a common thing. Well, why are you here? Because God said this was the place I was supposed to be. Well, can you give me more detail on that? No. This is just where I'm supposed to. I believe yesterday we were supposed to have 3 spots at a fall festival and introduce ourselves to, I don't even know how many people. And at the end of the day, I'm just sitting on the couch going, I just enjoyed God working yesterday. And I enjoyed the conversations that I heard all of you engaging in. Just wonderful. So, well, why would God do it that way? I don't know. But I love watching God work, and here's what I don't want to do. I don't want to reason myself out of God working in my life. I don't want to have so many questions about why God is doing it and give me the details, and you better give me 6 verses of exactly proving that this is what God told you to do. I like a verse, right? I love God speaking to me, but there's moments in my life where there's no verse. It's just so obvious that if you don't go, you're in rebellion to God. Now, that's not the Baptist answer. And the brethren are going to, they're going to eat that one up. But I'm the one standing before God someday. When I walk into his presence and he goes, first and foremost, it's going to be like if you had a good dad, let me preface that, right? Because maybe you didn't, and if you didn't, I'm sorry that you didn't. But there was nothing like my dad walking in the room going, hey. It could have been a good hey, but because he was walking in going, hey, I was automatically nervous. I don't want to get before God someday and have him go, why wouldn't you do that? Why didn't you follow that? Why wouldn't you get in line with that? Why wouldn't you get involved in that? And you know what the answer is going to be? We're not going to have an answer. The works of God, firstly, through the eyes of reasoning. Notice, secondly, in verses 13 through 34, through the eyes of religion. As has been the theme in John so far, religion shows up in every chapter. In verse 13, they present themselves. They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind. And it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And then again, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. And he said unto them, notice, so if you go and take verse 11 and just shrink it down, this is what he gives to the Pharisees. He put clay upon mine eyes, I washed and do see. That's all the detail that you're going to get. You don't deserve any more. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, this man is not of man of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath. Oh, vomit. What? Others said, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? But notice the glorious ending statement. And there was a division among them. Good. Because you know what it meant? Some of them were actually, for the first time in their life, starting to think for themselves. And if you get in a place, more specifically, if you get in a church and you can't think for yourself, you're not in a good place. I am not the oracle of God in your life. Come into the Holy of Holies after the service. May I bestow upon you no, whatever, man. You're holding the book that are the words of God that he intended for you to have. And if you want to know what God's saying to you, get in there. Verse 17, they said unto the blind man, what sayest thou of him that hath opened thine eyes? He said, he's a prophet. Because he literally doesn't know. It's like when you first got saved. You didn't know what to say. You didn't have an answer for that. But the Jews did not believe concerning him, no shocking there, that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, is this your son, whom ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see? His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him. He shall speak for himself. Notice with the eyes of religion, number one, the division that is created. Jesus said of himself in John 3:2, or in Luke 2:51, he said, suppose ye that I am come to give peace on the earth? I tell you nay, but rather division. Jesus causes division. Why? Because he makes people pick the truth or their own truth. He makes people pick truth or religion. Which one would you rather have? In the conversation with him and Nicodemus in John 3:2, he says, Rabbi, we know that thou art a teacher from God, for no man can do these miracles that thou doest except God be with him. Division is going to be created when I look at the works of God through the eyes of religion. When I view what God does through denominational eyes, I get myself in trouble. Do you know that there are other missionaries on the field that are seeing people saved that aren't Baptist missionaries? We may be ashamed someday to find out how many there are in comparison. Well, I've never met him. Yeah, I know. Notice in verse 17 through 23, the dismay cultivated. There's dismay with his parents. Why? Verse 22. These words spake his parents because they what? That's awful. That is to walk into the place where you're supposed to worship God and you're fearful. That doesn't go together. That's not the freedom that comes in Jesus Christ. But it happens all over the place. Oh, I just don't say nothing. I just don't make waves. That's dumb. They feared. John 19:38, after this, Joseph of Arimathea being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews. You know what our issue sometimes? We see the works of God. We know that God is working, but we're looking at it through the wrong eyes. You know what this entire passage is about? This entire passage should have took 10 verses. This passage is about a blind man that received his sight. But you get different angles on it. And Christian, if you take your life and you look at what God does in your life and through your life, through the eyes of religion, you're going to be in trouble. And you're going to limit what God will do. God can use you to do things you've never thought you would ever do. But you can't look at it through the eyes of everybody else. I know yesterday, and I talked to Ben about it, I know yesterday that we compromised. Because somebody this week's going to win a 50-inch TV. And somebody else is going to get a $100 Kuzno steak gift card. And then somebody else is going to get a $50 gift card to Meijer. And that's compromise. You know what it is? It's the work of God. Some of you got to say to some people, hey, there's no hooks in this at all. You just come over and then you got to start a conversation. And some of those conversations went deeper, and some of the people just wanted a TV. I'm good with that. Because they got to talk to someone that's a Christian that wasn't weird. At least I hope you weren't weird. They got to walk into a group of people that call themselves a church, and there wasn't a weird vibe. And they chatted with you while their kids' faces were being painted, and you were just hanging out and being there. I'm going to tell on Dan. Dan is my brother-in-law that's afraid of sharks. And Dan's a super quiet guy. He just keeps to himself. But I discovered yesterday that he's devious. He is. Those spots across from us, and there was no one there. So we actually had a lot of space, which was wonderful. And Dan just went over there by the trees and was standing there. And he did it on purpose because other people were coming standing there, and they began to ask him questions about this church up here. And he's like, yeah, I don't know. They're just giving away a TV. That's kind of weird. And Dan's like, well, there's no hooks. You just go up there, fill out the stuff. And if you don't want to be contacted, they won't ever contact you. And they're like, oh, really? And he's like, yeah, I mean, it's a free TV. Why not? So they're like, all right, great. And up they go, having no idea that he's a part of the whole thing. I didn't know we had a plan B, but I guess we did at that point. That was option 2, right? If you can't get him to walk up, get Dan to, just a little pressure from Dan, I'll get him up there for you. The dismay cultivated. You know what does that? The fear of man bringeth a snare. But whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe. It was so exciting to watch you yesterday. And I sat in the back, and I stood to the side, and if I needed to engage, I did. Why? It's not about me. It's about you interacting with other people and just enjoying being around other people. There shouldn't be fear watching God work. But when religion slides its way in between what God is doing in my life, I build up a lot of fear. And these parents are filled with fear because of what the Jews said they were going to do to them. Notice the disciple confirmed in verses 24 through 34. We'll finish verse 22. It says, because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore asked his parents, he is of age, ask him. Then again called they the man that was blind, and said unto him, give God the praise. So if you want to put this section, if you want to do the best example of biblical sarcasm, you can do from here down to about verse 34, 35. It's fantastic because they just go back and forth at each other. Obviously, I love it. It's super great. So they begin to talk to him in verse 24 and say, hey, they weren't giving God the praise for anything. You know what they were trying to do? They were trying to come around the other way in a sly way, saying, oh, we didn't mean all that other stuff. We're here to work. No, you're not. Luckily, he saw through it. Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. And he answered and said, well, I mean, whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. Like you can say it a bunch of different ways. You can speak it in Latin if you really want to. We could be reading the original Greek text this morning. But that's boring. But here's what I know. There was a day in my life that I was blind, and now I see, and religion didn't do that for me. Verse 26, then said they to him again, what did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, ye did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? Amen. Yeah. Then they reviled him and said, thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. He's been mostly dead all day. Like, big deal that you're Moses' disciple. No one cares. None of you have ever spoken to Moses. We know that God spake unto Moses, but as for this fellow, we know not from whence he is. Then the man answered and said unto them, this may be my favorite Bible verse. Why, herein is a marvelous thing. Oh, this is so wonderful, that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes? Are you telling me that you can't figure out that I was the guy that you all know was blind? Even though you tried to corner mom and dad on it, you know that I was the guy sitting there. And all of you walked by me and never gave me anything. And you're telling me you don't know who this guy is when now all of a sudden I can see? 1 + 1 = 2. There is only one person that can do this. Verse 31, now we know that God heareth not sinners. But if any man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. And here's religion. Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. But for him, it didn't matter. He's a disciple of Jesus Christ. And he really doesn't even know who Jesus Christ is yet. That's the amazing thing. The moment that you get saved, you don't understand. You didn't understand what just happened to you. You're just super excited that this person literally changed your life. I was blind and now I can see. Well, we disagree. Don't care. The moment you got saved, you had this heavy burden, and now that burden is gone. Well, I don't think God works that way. Don't care. All I know, all I can say to you, when the work of God happened in my life, I went from someone who was blind, and now I can see. Notice the works of God through the eyes of the reclaimed. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said unto him, dost thou believe on the Son of God? He answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? Jesus said unto him, thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. Notice, and through the eyes of the reclaimed, notice his willingness to believe. It's super easy to believe in God when you just work in the simplicity of how God works in your life. I don't have to think long and hard anymore about whether God is working in my life or not. It's really easy to see. It's really easy to navigate. Because I know who he is. I know what his voice sounds like. I know his moving in my life. I know his presence in my life. And this man said, hey, who is he so that I could believe? And Jesus said this, I'm standing right in front of you. And he said, I believe, and worshiped him. His willingness to believe, but then notice the worship because of the belief. I ought to be willing, because of the work of God in my life, to worship him. I ought to be willing, because of the work of God in my life, to just give him everything that I have. And no matter who's watching, no matter who beholds it, no matter who sees it, no matter who mocks it or makes fun of it. Have you ever gotten caught singing the praises of God in your car? I mean, you're into it. I see other people singing. I don't know what they are, but I love to see people sing in their car. It's just what they're in their own world, man. They're just doing their thing. It's fun. It's fun to behold. And this man, in front of all of these people, in front of everyone that's there, bows down and begins to worship him. Why? He realized what it meant for God to work in his life. And Jesus said in verse 4, that's why I'm sent here. I'm sent to work the works of God while it is day. And so no matter if they're picking up stones to stone me, no matter if they disagree, I'm here to work the works of God. And you're looking at the result of God working. Jesus said in verse 39, for judgment I am come into the world, that they which see not might see, and they which see might be made blind. But some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words, and said unto him, are we blind also? And Jesus said unto them, if ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, we see, therefore your sin remaineth. As we close, I want to close on that phrase, therefore your sin remaineth. You know what they were glorying in? They were glorying in the fact that they weren't blind as the common people. That they were somehow above everybody else. You realize that we weren't above anybody else that we talked to yesterday? And that the only difference between some of them and us is someone introduced you to Jesus Christ. The only difference. We're not better. And the Pharisees thought they were better. They thought because they weren't blind as the common people that they had some kind of a special ability. And the issue is that with that special ability meant this, that they were sufficient for their own guidance spiritually. They didn't need God's work in their life. They didn't need anybody to lead them. They didn't need this guy telling them what to do. And I tell you this morning that without Jesus Christ in your life, leading and guiding and directing, without the Holy Spirit of God's voice in your life, you'll see no work of God in your life. You can't ramp up the work of God sitting in a church service. Either God's here working and dealing and talking, or he's not. I can't conjure God up. I don't have a special ability. I'm not above other people. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 3:5, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. You know what the blind man learned? He learned he needed Jesus Christ. And I don't know how many years he sat on the wayside begging. I don't know how many years he was in that position. But on this day, his life changed. The work of God entered into his life. And he was a different person because of the work of God. Is God working in your life? Are you seeing God's hand work in your life? Is your life changing because your relationship with God is real and tangible and you can feel it, and that's not charismatic? How are you viewing the works of God? How do you see it? It would be good, go back to the day that you got saved. Go back to the day that maybe you just rededicated your life to God. Go back to the day maybe as a teenager that you got reassurance of yourself. Go back to that day and that moment when you knew and you had that peace and that calmness and that assurance that only comes from the work of God in your life. There's not a church service that could replace the work of God in your life. And this man said, One thing I know, whereas I was blind, now I see. Why? The works of God. It's the only explanation. Let's bow our heads this morning. I want the work of God in my life. I want to continue to see him move. I want to see his hand here. I want to be able to step back and not be able to explain the things that I'm seeing him do. I want to be able to, had two pastor friends text me last night and say, hey, how did today go? We were praying, and I didn't even know how to say it. Didn't even know how to define it. Other than this, I watched God work today. I watched God's people just be willing to be there and to talk about whatever and to be engaged with other people. And church, we need that. We have to have that. We will not thrive without it. We will be stuck in the place that we are right now if we start viewing things through the eyes of reasoning and through the eyes of religion. Let God work in your life. As the piano plays this morning, if God spoke to you, you come and speak to him. Stand to your feet this morning. The song she's playing is 220. Wonderful song. Man, this should be our life. So I'm not big about speaking about the works of God. All you're doing is telling somebody what Jesus Christ did in your life. It's all you're doing. Sing the first and last verse of this song this morning. Page 220.
Jesus, since I found in him a friend so strong and true, I would tell you how he changed my life completely. He did something that no other friend could do. No one ever cared for me like Jesus. There's no other friend so kind as he. Could take the sin and darkness from me. Oh, how much he cared for me. Every day he comes to me with new assurance. More and more I understand his words of love. But I'll never know just why he came to save me, till someday I see his blessed face above. No one ever cared for me like Jesus. There's no other friend so kind as he. No one else could take the sin and darkness from me. Oh, how much he cared for.
We're going to do a couple things this morning. You can be seated. Brother Ben, if you could, I know you got one asleep. But if you could just make your way up here, grab everybody, wherever they all are. One is close. Just, if you just stand right down. No, you can come up here, bro. Come up, stand right next to me. I knew I